The Watchers call. From the darkness, we observe.
The data slate trembled in Magos biologist archivist Livius Theta's augmented grip as he reviewed the impossible for the 7th time in 4 minutes. Medical Deck Gamma-7 had spontaneously grown replacement crew from archived tissue samples, blood smears, dental fragments, dermal scrapings that had seeded themselves in empty bunks and become men. One resurrected Cadian guardsman woke reciting current shipwide access codes, the encrypted sequences carved as hypertrophic scars across his regenerated chest. Verification accurate. The hospital ship sanctuary of St. Urdain hung dead in high anchor above Shrine World Velatrix Secundus, thrusters cold, saints' lamps guttered, yet somehow alive with impossible flesh. Beyond the blast shutters, the void pressed clean and crystalline against armored transparasteel. Inside, humid air clung to his augmetics like brine, thick with recycled saline and something organic his enhanced olfactory sensors couldn't categorize. The ship's interior wept condensation along cathedral iron ribs, creating thermal gradients that suggested active metabolism in sections containing no living crew. Litanies peeled from bulkheads hung in damp curls, their sacred words dissolving into the saturated atmosphere. The sound threaded through the Vox floor like a heartbeat that forgot where to stop. Livius Theta marked the frequency and continued his examination. Navy cordon vessels maintained position with quarantine torpedoes armed, their commanders delivering polite threats through encrypted channels while setting a temporal sand glass. 6 hours to assay contamination levels and classify the anomaly before orbital bombardment reduced St. Urdain to plasma and memory. Inquisitrix Severine's voice crackled through his cranial implants, winter sharp with controlled urgency. Magos, the flesh, is acting as a biological cogitator. This violates fundamental Imperial doctrine. Explain. Her Rosarius clicked against lacquered carapace as she awaited his response from the command deck. The evidence arranged itself with insolent clarity. Guardsman designation Caston Vire, formerly a cryo sample in Locker 11 Gamma, now breathed saline thicker than plasma and blinked with mechanical precision. When questioned, his dermis puckered and supplied correct authentication responses in raised letters. Under microscopic analysis, fibroblasts aligned like scriptoria scribes, chromatin spooling to rhythm while proteins folded into cipher key configurations. The flesh had become palimpsest, storing and accessing encrypted data through cellular memory. Triangular scarification patterns bloomed across the revived, 3 equilateral cuts meeting to points over sternum, throat, and palm. Under their skin, letters rose as if pressed from reverse. The phrase materialized repeatedly. Flesh forgets, the machine remembers, but scrawled backwards in fresh dermis, mirror script, readable only in polished steel. The inverted litany burned through his logic stacks like acid through sacred oils. Vox intercept, Imperial Navy frigate hammer of purgation. Cordon established, Inquisitrix. Target lock confirmed. All torpedo tubes armed, awaiting final authorization. Livius Theta sectioned tissue samples with monolancets, watching wound edges re-zip along predetermined suture lines while forming new characters as blood clotted. The resurrected stirred throughout the medical decks, reaching for each other's scars as if reading them by touch, like pilgrims passing prayer beads. 17 more subjects exhibited identical phenomena, perfect biological reconstruction from minimal tissue, complete with sensitive data inscribed upon their very being. The ship's Vox system activated without authorization, flooding corridors with transmission from deep within the medical core. A child's voice emerged, unaugmented and achingly familiar, speaking with inflections that matched his own pre-augmetic vocal patterns. Marcus, it said, using the name the Skola had burned away decades ago, the one he'd sworn into the Omnissiah and left behind. Marcus, come home. His servo skulls recoiled as if struck, their machine spirits registering data corruption, while the ninefold chime pulsed through atmospheric currents that carried conductive saline mist. The voice echoed through passages that should have been empty, originating from sections sealed for weeks. Livius Theta's remaining biological components responded with involuntary chemical releases his internal diagnostics couldn't suppress. Severine's image flickered on his main display, her face grim against sterile white uniform. The implications are clear, Magos. Something is teaching the flesh to remember what it should forget. We have... The digits crawled across his retinal display like burning insects. Livius Theta's mechadendrites moved with sudden purpose, interfacing with docking bay controls as he overrode automated lockdown protocols. The sanctuary's umbilical doors began their ponderous opening sequence, revealing darkness where answers waited among the impossible living dead. "Immediate boarding authorized," he transmitted, his vox grill distorting words into something almost human. The skiff surged forward as grapnels bit, and the ship answered with its ninefold chime. The umbilicals sealed with the wet kiss of atmospheric compliance, and Inquisitrix Severine advanced through the breach in measured steps, her stormcoat rustling against lacquered carapace while rosarious beads clicked in calculated rhythm. Sister Hospitaller Mirabelle flanked her left, sensors low, sacred incense mingling with phenol antiseptic that clawed at rebreather filters. Tempestus Scion Squad Sigma 3 maintained staggered formation, Hellguns tracking corners with disciplined precision under strict lumen discipline. Skitari Rangers Hark and Zeta bracketed the rear, their galvanic rifles interfacing with Livius Theta's servo skulls for overlapping reconnaissance. Patterns condensed breath frosted bionics despite regulated temperature, while protein condensation slicked deck plating with organic films that reformed faster than sanctified wipers could clear them. The sanctuary's corridors stretched like arteries, their walls weeping condensation that carried impossible scents, sacred oils mixed with biological decay that should have consumed itself weeks ago. Deck plating flexed microscopically underfoot, the metal responding like living tissue beneath magnetized boot soles. 27 drum beats pulsed through the structure, synchronized with what remained of the ship's dying heartbeat. Livius Theta's internal chronometer registered the precise 27 Hz frequency, each pulse accompanied by triangular symbols painted in oxidizing coagulant along bulkhead seams. The geometric patterns stank of iron and old prayers, their points oriented toward maintenance chapels and medici nodes with deliberate precision. Ferrous contamination, Ranger Hark reported through SquadNet, his rebreather clogging with metallic spores that puffed from ventilation roses. Mirabelle traced the sign of St. Urdain's wound over Scion cheek plates, while Livius Theta purged microspores with heated argon, logging the mold's morphology against proscribed archives. His servo skulls drifted ahead, returning chittering cant through binharic pinging that echoed recursive purity scans. The Medici subhub announced itself with sweet rot of formalin and hym ink. Autoquills moved along the walls like mechanical insects, their blessed nibs inscribing prayers directly into living plaster that rose and fell like sleeping lungs. Sacred words sank and resurfaced as the membrane remembered and reviewed each line, the litany of pure flesh reforming itself into unsettling verses that made Mirabelle whisper ward prayers under her breath. 3 alcoves held reliquary identifications, saints' knucklebones and glass ampules floating in viscous preservative, all wired to node cogitators that pulsed with slow peristalsis rather than logic cycles. The air grew thicker, almost viscous, as they approached the chamber's center where a body waited on a failed hover gurney. "Omnissiah preserve," Livius Theta whispered through his Vox grill. The preserved corpse bore medici-grade preparation markers and autopsy sigils. 3 equilateral cuts meeting over sternum and wrists, triangular scarification raised like braille. Neural tendrils thick as cables had grown from skull and chest, rooting into conduit systems through jury-rigged connections that pulsed with bioluminescent activity. Designation, Medici Orderly Thane, he reported after parsing identification markers. Deceased 14 days ago from acute radiation poisoning, yet neural patterns persist within ship systems. The dead man's lips moved in perfect synchronization, mouthing binary cant at precisely 27 syllables per phrase. Livius Theta activated Vox translators, resolving the silent movements into encrypted data streams flowing directly into the ship's neural networks. The corpse had become a biological relay, processing information through organic matrices that should have decayed into base proteins days ago. "It's communicating," Severine breathed, her power sword humming as Blessed Edge cast harsh shadows across weeping walls. The dead do not speak the Omnissiah's tongue. Neural tendrils brightened as if responding to her words, their phosphorescent glow intensifying, while binary streams flowed through circuits that existed between flesh and machine. Sister Mirabelle's medical scanner detected impossible vital signs, cellular activity without circulatory function, neural firing without metabolic support. The preserved body had become a living archive, storing data in patterns too complex for standard Imperial technology to replicate. Triangular scarification patterns emerged across exposed skin as they watched, forming geometric precision that matched symbols painted throughout the ship. Each triangle contained micro-inscriptions in languages predating Imperial Gothic, their meanings triggering warning runes across Livius Theta's cogitator arrays. A sudden spasm racked the corpse. Neural tendrils pulled taut against conduits while the Medici orderly's jaw worked with audible creaks. The tongue crept forward, desiccating as it moved, fissuring into sharp-edged planes until the muscle hardened into a sigil key of angular facets. The geometry matched triangular motifs smeared on the hub's chapel doors. "Movement protocol," Severine commanded. Zeta stepped back, mag locks clacking, while Sigma-3 compressed breach stacks with reverent precision. The living plaster quivered, pulling back from the chapel lock as autoquills paused mid-stroke, needle tips dripping ink that beaded like sweat. Mirabelle whispered the sanctus of connection and touched the lock with relic bone. They smelled ozone and hot phenol, incense and wet iron as the corridor flexed again, a slow swallow. The drumbeats resolved into numbers his implants could parse before rational mind would concede them. SquadNet crackled with incoming transmission, a 9-digit sequence that matched the ship's cycler cadence exactly, each number corresponding to the 9-fold chime pulsing through atmospheric currents. As the sequence completed its third triad, sealed doors throughout the section unlocked autonomously, ancient mechanisms responding to commands from systems that should have been dead for weeks. The chapel lock drank the tongue's geometry and flashed cold as something stirred beyond. The chapel doors parted with the wet whisper of organic seals, releasing humid air that carried metallic salinity and the ghost scent of phenol antiseptic. Vox Chapel 9 stretched before them in impossible geometry, its walls quilted in sutured vellum that pulsed with the ship's dying rhythm. Each membrane panel was stitched with medical precision, taut and faintly translucent, flexing in peristaltic waves that followed the 27-beat cadence echoing through the sanctuary's bones. Between each 27th pulse came profound silence, a held breath that made the chapel seem to listen. Sister Hospitaller Mirabelle stepped across the threshold with reverent caution, her censers swaying as incense mingled with the brackish atmosphere. The central relic dominated the nave, Saint Urdain's dermis fragment suspended in blessed ceramite, its crystalline housing wreathed in perpetual bioluminescence that cast shifting shadows across the sutured walls. Temperature gradients created visible convection currents, swirling the humid air into organic eddies, while condensation wept from the vellum in geometric patterns, forming triangular tessellations that pointed toward hidden alcoves. "Blessed Saint Urdain," Mirabelle intoned, beginning the standard litany of approach, "guide us through flesh's frailty to the Emperor's truth." Her words rang clear in the saturated air, but the walls echoed antiphons half-beat late, learning her cadence as the sutured panels darkened where her voice touched them most directly. The vellum was memorizing sacred verses, storing them in organic matrices that pulsed with each recitation. Livius Theta activated deep-spectrum auspex, his servo skulls chittering binaric warnings as they mapped architectural elements that bent subtly away from imperial construction protocols. Angles deviated by degrees that triggered vertigo in his remaining organic components, creating Escher-like impossibilities that made his optical sensors recalibrate continuously. The spiral nave concealed maintenance access points behind false walls, their locations marked by triangular scarification that matched patterns throughout the ship. Tempestus Scion Squad Sigma 3 maintained staggered positions along the aisles, their hellguns tracking micro-tremors in the living walls, while Skitarii Rangers Hark and Zeta spread overlapping auspex nets. When Livius Theta brought his scanners closer to the vellum surface, spore mist bloomed from the membrane, microscopic filaments that drifted toward their breathing apparatus, attempting to seal intake ports with skin plugs formed from ambient protein. "Rebreather resistance rising," Scion Caney reported through SquadNet, his voice tight with controlled unease, filters grinding against organic matter. Livius Theta purged his systems with heated argon while examining dermal inscriptions that covered the altar's ceramite base in microscopic script. The text detailed casualty reports that shouldn't exist, names and designations of personnel killed in actions not yet transmitted to astropaths, deaths that hadn't occurred according to official records, yet appeared carved in living tissue with disturbing accuracy. Each entry was accompanied by triangular marks, identical to those found on the resurrected guardsman, with the number 27 woven throughout the patterns, like a silent mantra. Above the central relic, a parchment banner hung suspended, its surface displaying corrected litany in fresh scarification that rose and fell like breathing skin. The words reformed themselves as he watched. "The flesh remembers," replacing the traditional imperial creed, in script that leaked crimson ink onto sanctified stone. Autoquills emerged from hidden alcoves, inscribing new prayers directly into the living walls, while sacred words sank and resurfaced as the membrane learned and adapted. "Inquisitrix," he transmitted through cranial implants, "the chapel is actively rewriting imperial doctrine. This constitutes prima facie heresy of the highest order." Severine's response crackled with controlled fury. "Document everything, Magos. We'll need evidence for the Ordo Biologicus tribunal." His mechadendrites detected subtle seams in the vellum behind the central relic, concealed by complex overlays of dermal patterns. Hidden mechanisms clicked as he interfaced with concealed access ports, triggering ancient locks that responded to his augmetic touch. A compartment slid open with the wet sound of parting flesh, revealing maintenance codes etched in flayed skin alongside a Collegia biologist's warning seal that bore triangular scarification instead of the traditional aquila. The preserved dermis contained encrypted sequences that matched ship-wide access protocols, biological storage of sensitive data that violated fundamental imperial doctrine regarding the separation of flesh and machine. The skin was supple, recently flayed, and still warm to his thermal sensors. Someone had carved authorization codes into human tissue, creating living archives that could bypass standard security measures through cellular authentication. Rhythmic silence stretched between each 27th pulse, while the walls processed information through organic circuits that glowed with bioluminescent activity. The vellum panels learned from their presence, mimicking their movements and vocal patterns with increasing accuracy. Mirabelle's prayers echoed back in perfect synchronization now, the chapel having mastered her cadence and begun improvising variations on sacred themes. Movement detected, Ranger Hark reported, his galvanic rifle tracking anomalous readings along the starboard bulkhead. The wall surface rippled like disturbed water, flesh tones emerging from standard imperial gray as cellular material reorganized itself into familiar features. "Contact right," Scion Caney called out, his hellgun snapping toward the disturbance. The bulkhead extruded a face wearing his exact features, complete with regimental scarification and augmetic eyepiece, breathing in perfect synchronization with his respiratory rhythm. The doppelganger's lips moved in silent binary cant, while neural patterns flowed through organic circuits embedded in the wall structure. For 3 heartbeats, 2 identical faces stared at each other across the chapel's humid air, one flesh and blood, the other living memory carved in impossible biology. Then the wall face melted back into standard texture with a soft sigh, leaving only faint triangular impressions in the metal surface and the lingering scent of ozone mixed with biological decay. The chapel pulsed once more, 27 beats echoing through sutured walls that remembered everything they witnessed. The maintenance shaft descended through corroded adamantium like a steel trachea, its walls weeping protein condensation that pooled in triangular patterns along the descent route. Livius Theta's servo skulls mapped their progress through Binharic pinging, while Tempestus Scions maintained staggered formation, mag boots clanking against rungs, slick with organic films that seemed to pulse with the ship's dying rhythm. The 27-beat cadence grew stronger as they descended, reverberating through narrow confines until it synchronized with their respirator cycles and heartbeats in disturbing harmony. Sister Hospitaller Mirabelle's sensors swayed with increased urgency, releasing sacred smoke that mixed uneasily with humid air, thick with formaldehyde and metallic blood scent. Her rosarious beads clicked against lacquered carapace in rapid prayer sequences as ferrous molds clogged their rebreathers with microscopic filaments that drifted like organic snow through the shaft's cramped interior. Medici Theater 27 opened beneath them like a wound in the ship's body, blast doors parting with wet, organic seals that exhaled humid air, carrying impossible scents. The chamber stretched in cathedral proportions, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows, while autopsy benches arranged themselves in precise triangular formation across deck plating that flexed microscopically underfoot. Each surgical table bore implements that gleamed with more than blessed oils, their surfaces reflecting geometries that made optical sensors recalibrate continuously. Drainage gutters carved into the deck brimmed with translucent gel, threaded by copper-colored veins that pulsed with bioluminescent activity. The substance moved with deliberate purpose, flowing against gravity to pool around autopsy tables, while forming complex neural networks that sparkled with electrical discharge. Livius Theta's deep spectrum analysis identified the impossible. organopolymeric nemogel seeded with binaric data nodes, forbidden archival substrate used during the dark age of technology by the biologists cast to store information in living tissue. "Blessed Emperor, preserve us," Sister Mirabelle whispered, her voice tight with religious dread as she traced Saint Urdain's wound over her chest. "We compel the dead to testify again through unholy means." Her contrition prayers rose like incense, while the gel responded to their presence, forming translucent columns that mimicked laryngeal structures with disturbing accuracy. Preserved tissue fragments suspended within the substance began vocalizing in stolen voices. Medici, personnel, ship's crew, passengers whose vocal patterns had been archived in organic memory banks. The voices overlapped in harmonious discord, reciting casualty reports in perfect synchronization with the ship's pulse while learning cadence, timbre, and malice from ambient conversations. The nemogel was learning faster than it could be studied, adapting to Imperial technology with predatory efficiency while demonstrating behavior that violated fundamental principles of cause and effect. Copper veins brightened as it processed information through biological matrices, creating living blueprints that stored structural data in cellular memory, while mapping the ship's layout through organic circuits that pulsed with each heartbeat, echoing through vaulted spaces. Triangular scarification patterns emerged on the GL's surface, forming tessellations that pointed toward maintenance chapels and Medici nodes with mathematical precision. The substance was becoming something between flesh and machine, incorporating mechanical knowledge into organic matrices through processes that defied Imperial classification while growing brighter with each acquisition of blessed components. "Movement detected," Skitarii Ranger Hark reported, his galvanic rifle tracking anomalous readings near the chamber's central surgical platform. A preservation alcove flickered with activation runes as stasis fields collapsed around a surgical servitor that had been dormant for weeks. The mechanized assistant stirred with grinding servo joints, its spinal cord riddled with script that glowed through translucent casing like lightning carved into nerve tissue. The servitor's optical sensors focused with mechanical precision while neural interfaces sparked with electrical discharge. Its Vox grill activated, producing words in the ship's Medici officer's voice. "Hidden Ward C requires immediate attention. Casualty processing protocols have been modified. Internal systems fought against organic contamination that had seeded itself throughout neural networks, creating conflicts between machine spirit and biological imperatives." Livius Theta approached with measured steps, his mechadendrites interfacing with diagnostic ports, while sacred oils leaked from compromised seals. The spinal cord contained inscriptions in languages predating Imperial Gothic, their meanings triggering warning runes across his cogitator arrays, while describing medical procedures that violated the Codex Biologicus through techniques bordering on techno-heresy. "The flesh remembers what the machine forgets," the servitor intoned before its internal systems began self-disassembling in ritualistic patterns. Limbs folded into prayer knot configurations, while neural interfaces sparked and died, leaving geometric arrangements of blessed components that formed triangular tessellations across the surgical platform. The machine had chosen destruction over continued contamination, its machine spirit recognizing corruption that threatened the Omnissiah's sacred principles. The nemogel surged toward disassembled components, absorbing blessed oils and sacred materials, while growing brighter with each acquisition. Temperature gradients created convection currents that swirled humid air into organic eddies, while autopsy tables began moving with subtle precision, their positions shifting to create new triangular formations, pointing toward unexplored ship sections. Deck plating flickered beneath their mag boots, revealing lumen afterimages that lasted precisely 27 heartbeats before fading. In those ghostly illuminations, they glimpsed children lying in beds where none existed, small forms with triangular scarification covering their skin, lips moving in silent binary cant, while neural patterns flowed through circuits embedded in their flesh. The images repeated with mechanical precision, each cycle revealing more details of impossible patients receiving treatments that violated every principle of imperial medicine. The after-images faded, leaving only gel flowing through drainage gutters and the distant pulse counting down toward something waiting in the ship's core. The shaped charges kissed ward seas, reinforced seals, and dimmed blast doors parting with hydraulic sighs that released cloying heat like breath from fevered lungs. Thermal shock struck their rebreathers as humidity spiked beyond atmospheric processors' capacity, turning recycled air to syrup, while frosting then flooding bionics in conflicting temperature gradients. The pediatric ward stretched before them in cathedral silence, rows of empty medpods arranged with medical precision, while biofoam linings retained body-shaped impressions of patients who had vanished weeks ago, their absence screaming louder than any alarm system. Sister Hospitaller Mirabelle's sensors swayed with increased urgency as corrupted Hospitaller cadences threaded through the 27-beat thrum. Sacred lullabies had been slowed to match the ship's dying pulse, their melodies twisted into something that made her rosarious beads click against lacquered carapace in rapid prayer sequences. "Cadences of the creche," she whispered, voice unsteady with recognition. Our own healing songs, wrongly slowed, corrupted. The familiar became profane through subtle alteration. Childhood comfort transformed into organic horror that violated every principle of Medici sanctuary. Bacterial films spawned in the humid atmosphere, creating neural networks that clung to Auspex lenses like organic spider webs while processing ambient data through biological matrices. The strings pulsed with bioluminescent activity, forming connections between medical equipment that should have been powered down for weeks, yet continued displaying vital signs for patients who existed only as pressure patterns in blessed ceramite. Livius Theta's servo skulls mapped the ward through binharic pinging that returned impossible readings, life signs without bodies, neural activity without brains, heartbeats synchronized with the ship's pulse while originating from empty space. Each pod bore more than impressions. His sensors detected residual pressure patterns that recorded pulse rates, breathing rhythms, and the desperate scratches of tiny fingernails etching names into biofoam alongside triangular scarification that matched symbols throughout the ship. The absence of standard Medici sounds created profound unease. No hum of life support systems, no whisper of air recyclers, no electronic beeping from monitoring equipment. Only the 27-beat pulse echoed through vaulted spaces, while recycled breath created convection currents that swirled humid air into patterns resembling neural pathways, each circulation carrying the ghost scent of phenol antiseptic and something organic his enhanced olfactory sensors couldn't categorize. Tempestus Scion Nate moved through the ward with disciplined precision, his Hellgun tracking thermal anomalies while unconsciously tracing triangular sigils over his chest armor. The gesture came unbidden, muscle memory responding to geometric patterns that decorated every surface with mathematical precision. His fingers moved in ritualistic sequences that matched scarification found throughout the ship, creating sacred geometry through unconscious repetition that synchronized with the ward's acoustic properties. The starboard bulkhead puckered beside Nate as if drawing breath, metallic surface softening like yielding flesh. A child-sized hand budded from paint and plating, fingers translucent with capillary networks. closing around his gauntlet with impossible tenderness. The grip lasted precisely 27 heartbeats before retracting, peeling like wet parchment and leaving skin-script coordinates burned into blessed ceramite like brand marks. "Contact confirmed," Nate reported, examining the raised symbols while his hellgun tracked the wall's return to normal texture. Livius Theta's mechadendrites interfaced with diagnostic ports, parsing the coordinates through recursive purity scans that returned clean binharic. No warp lexems, no cipher rot, precise as Imperial navigation protocols, yet carved in living tissue that violated fundamental doctrine regarding flesh-machine separation. The numbers matched service crawlspace access routes leading toward the ship's core shrine, creating navigation data through biological authentication that bypassed standard security measures. Cross-referencing against architectural schematics revealed hidden maintenance veins threading beneath devotional flooring, triangulated by 3 chapel nodes in perfect geometric alignment. Movement protocol, Inquisitrix Severine commanded through cranial implants. These coordinates lead directly to the core sanctum. The entity is guiding us deeper. Bacterial strings formed connections between empty pods, creating neural networks that processed information through organic circuits, while learning from each interaction with Imperial personnel. The ward was becoming something between hospital and cogitator, storing patient data in living tissue, while pod linings preserved emotional resonance, fear and pain archived in organic memory, alongside medical procedures that violated the Codex Biologicus through techniques bordering on techno-heresy. As they moved toward the coordinates indicated access point, Scion Nate vanished mid-sweep, his hellgun clattering to deck plating while atmospheric disturbance marked his position with swirling condensation. No transporter signature, no warp displacement, simply absence where presence had been, as if the lumen had blinked wrong and never corrected. 3 seconds stretched like wire, the starboard bulkhead flushed, pores rising as letters lifted from paint in raised scar tissue, pale and wet. N-A-T-E. His voice breathed from the metal in exact timbre, small as a bedside secret, carrying authentication codes that shouldn't have existed in organic memory. Sanctum, the walls whispered in Nate's vocal patterns, the word echoing through empty pods while bacterial strings brightened with electrical discharge. The ward had consumed him completely, adding his neural patterns to organic archives, while his authentication opened sealed passages throughout the ship. And somewhere in the core shrine, something vast and patient began to stir. The service ducts constricted like diseased arteries around their advance, walls lined with sutured flesh that pulsed in slow heartbeat rhythm, while weeping protein condensation that pooled in triangular formations along deck plating. Livius Theta's mechadendrites scraped against organic filaments as his MIU nerve socket tingled with unauthorized interface attempts, the bio-network reaching toward his augmetics with hungry curiosity. Each pulse carried electrical discharge that made his internal systems recalibrate continuously while phantom warmth bloomed along induction coils as the entity presented itself as blessed interface, leaking hints of childhood thunder through his firewall litanies. He purged the invasive sensations with heated argon, servo skulls chittering binharic warnings as they detected cognitive functions from surfaces that shouldn't possess them. The Nemogel was learning from proximity alone, absorbing personal information through electromagnetic resonance while mimicking their most sacred recitations with disturbing accuracy. Inquisitrix Severine's confessionals echoed from ventilation seams in her exact vocal patterns, private penitence made public through organic memory that violated every principle of spiritual sanctuary. Sister Hospitaller Mirabelle's novenas drifted through humid air as the flesh learned her cadence, sacred words twisted into biological harmonics that made her rosarious beads click against lacquered carapace in rapid prayer sequences. Even Livius Theta's initiation rites whispered from bacterial strings, the harsh cant of the modular. Purge burned into him in Mars' red deserts, now softened echoes pronounced by mouths made of gel and wire. The substance was consuming their devotions, storing religious observance in living tissue, while creating corrupted versions that blended imperial doctrine with organic imperatives. Tempestus Scions, Sigma 3 maintained staggered formation through the constricted passage, their hellguns tracking thermal anomalies while ammunition fouled with protein accretions that bloomed across feed lips like pale barnacles. Military pragmatism warred with religious dread as blessed rounds grew sticky with organic films that threatened firing mechanisms with biological contamination. Immediate purge recommended, Scion Caney reported through SquadNet, his voice distorted by rebreather filters clogged with ferrous spores. Weapons fouling at unacceptable rates. Authorization denied, Severine replied, voice calibrated to cut noise without waking the walls. We waste ammunition that fouls the second it leaves a barrel. The absence of normal ship noise created profound unease. No vermin scuttling through maintenance spaces, no tick of relays, no devotional motors, no coolant chatter. Only the 27-beat pulse echoed through organic corridors, while whispered breath created convection currents that carried impossible scents of phenol antiseptic mixed with biological decay that should have consumed itself weeks ago. Bacterial films spawned across optical sensors, creating neural networks that processed ambient data through biological matrices while servo skulls switched to short-burst pinging to stay ahead of contamination. The core shrine, Livius Theta decided, calculating contamination risk versus tactical necessity. Read-only ritual interface. No write permissions, no handshake. We observe the machine spirit's periphery without letting it name us. Name is the vector, Mirabelle whispered, catching the thought with hospitaller precision. It eats names and grows. It catalogs, he corrected. It remembers by binding proper nouns to cellular patterns. We deny the proper noun. The duct's tightened, collapsed tracheae reminding lungs how to be afraid. Protein films blinded his auspex twice in as many minutes. He purged with heated argon, and the walls responded by cooling the air around the nozzle, trapping vented heat in trembling pockets he could sense on his forearms. The entity was learning their countermeasures, adapting to imperial technology with predatory efficiency. A new spheric packet pinged his cortex with impossible familiarity. Data streams formatted in patterns that matched his pre-augmetic neural architecture, carrying information his enhanced systems shouldn't recognize. The transmission contained a childhood prayer whispered in the Skola's dormitories, words spoken only in darkness when fear overcame faith and flesh sought comfort in forbidden remembrance. The prayer echoed through his consciousness in his own child voice, unaugmented and achingly vulnerable. All the cogs and all the saints, let the little gears not grind. Let the sparks be stars and the smoke be clouds. Let the boy be brass and the brass be brave. No one had ever recorded those words. They lived only in the air between him and memory, a bridge already ruined by time, when the red priests marched him into the racks. The prayer terminated with geometric precision, each syllable corresponding to door sigil coordinates that burned across his retinal display. The bulkhead ahead puckered and breathed inward, opening with the pilgrim's cipher extruding briefly like a tongue before retracting. Pilgrim's deck yawned beyond, a cathedral space where devotional candles should have blazed in perpetual vigil. Instead, the first bank of lumen strips died with apologetic chirps Then the next, lights failing in sequence toward the altar like kneeling supplicants. Darkness advanced in measured 27-beat strides, and the pulse grew louder as if the ship were holding its breath to hear what they would name next. The pilgrim's deck received them like a lung taking air after drowning, exhaling warm drafts that set guttering candles to lean and spit wax across devotional rails. The cathedral space had been transformed into an ossuary of impossible geometry, reliquary racks rising in terraces to the hull curve, while bone relics arranged themselves in 27 triangle mosaics that covered every surface with mathematical precision. Sacred remains gleamed with more than blessed oils, their surfaces weeping tears of cerebrospinal fluid that pooled in triangular formations across sanctified stone, creating patterns that pointed toward the central altar with disturbing certainty. The ship's hull exhaled in pulses that matched the dying heartbeat, carrying brackish heat from the skin of space into the nave, where cold and warmth braided into convection currents that made the air shimmer like sanctified mirage. Temperature gradients created visible optical distortions that transformed the bone mosaics into breathing geometries, while ossuary acoustics amplified whispers into layered harmonies that violated every principle of imperial hymnody through subtle corruption. The rhythmic thrum that had haunted every deck adjusted timbre until it found chant structure, dissecting itself into stanzas and response, while bacterial strings processed acoustic data through biological matrices. What had been bass pulse became drone line, then treble thread, then child soprano voices that emerged from bone geometry itself. Femurs laid as beams, ulnae and radii as struts, phalanges set like tesserae so the curves of spines and flat litany of ribs refracted sacred words into familiar melodies from induction shrines and creches. Sister Hospitaller Mirabelle fell to her knees with practiced devotion as the ossuary began singing her personal vows in children's voices, not merely words but cadences, stumbles, the breath between lines, private devotions spoken only during her novitiate now echoing through cathedral acoustics that transformed whispers into impossible chorus. I bind my hands to healing and my tongue to truth. The choir of bones intoned in perfect harmony, using vocal patterns from her childhood, while sacred remains wept fluid that carried her own genetic markers. She remained transfixed, rosarious beads clicking against lacquered carapace as her own prayers surrounded her in corrupted symphony. Livius Theta catalogued the arrays in long measures because enumeration defended the mind against peripheral movement, femurs rotating in reliquary mounts, skull fragments tracking their positions with empty sockets, triangular scarification emerging and fading across bone surfaces like breathing skin. His servo skulls returned impossible readings, life signs without bodies, neural activity without brains, heartbeats synchronized with the ship's pulse, while originating from arrangements of blessed remains that had become sensory organs processing ambient data through biological matrices. Tempestus Scion Sigma 3 established overlapping fire zones while their weapons fouled with increasing urgency. Tendril membranes coated weapon barrels with clotting proteins that congealed across muzzle brakes and sight housings like scabs, while Skitarii Rangers Hark and Zeta reported motion ping malfunctions as neural networks interfered with targeting systems. Everything is reading as living tissue, Hark transmitted, his galvanic rifle sparking as he peeled away organic films that pulsed weakly in his gauntlet before burning them with whispered argon. By authority vested in me by writ of seal and brand of office, Inquisitrix Severine murmured, her voice narrowing to a killing edge. Excommunicate traitorous ordinances. 12 through 16 are here recited, with punitive appendix concerning animate heresies that speak in human voice. Submit petition for delay under archival data privilege. Codicil 227 Gamma. Livius Theta answered in formal counterpoint, his mechadendrites interfacing with data slates. When primary anomaly constitutes a pre-heresy biologist substrate of unknown scope, immediate purge risks obliteration of evidence, critical to doctrinal prosecution. The bones near them trembled as if following the rhythms of their legal antiphon, and there was strange comfort in being heard, even by things that should not hear. The bone arrangements pulsed with vascular networks that had grown through marrow cavities, creating circulatory systems that connected sacred remains across the deck in a vast neural web. Fine vessels, too red for dust and too wet for oil, threaded the mosaics so that femurs pumped and metatarsals twitched like valves. Each 27th beat sending ripples of perfusion across reliquary terraces, while crystal housings wept cerebrospinal fluid that beaded and ran, tasting the air before falling to devotional stones in measured drops that splashed in triangles. Movement flickered constantly at vision's periphery, candles bending a second too late, bone lattice tightening against warm exhale, saints' radii flexing as if vertebrate again. The ossuary was learning from their presence, adapting triangular patterns to incorporate their movements and vocal signatures while storing personal information in organic memory banks that violated fundamental imperial doctrine regarding flesh-machine separation. The central reliquary platform stirred with peristaltic hydraulics hidden in devotional plinths, ascending with a sigh that could have been steam or breath. Arterial cables, red-sheathed and wet, slithered from beneath the altar and hooked into the rising mass with careful, practiced insertions as something vast emerged from the deck's heart. "There is something under there," Mirabelle said without turning, without breaking posture. "There has always been something under there." The machine sarcophagus rose in blessed ceramite, casing overlaid with gilded script and sutured directly to a chassis whose lines spoke of Crusade-era reliquary machines, designed to store pieces of holy flesh in antiseptic triumph. Arterial cables thrummed with peristalsis as power and fluid moved in synchronized beats, while nemogel reservoirs pulsed where data vats should have sat. Translucent sacs threaded with copper veins that carried binaric nodes like clusters of grapes. Triangular wards, reversed as everywhere throughout the ship, had been carved into sacrificial panels and then healed over, leaving pale ridges like scars around machine ports. The device tilted without apparent mechanism and faced them with a visor that had once displayed saints' names, but now showed only skin grown where glass should be, pale, hairless, veined. Beneath that membrane, something moved like fish under ice, while internal systems activated with grinding servo joints, consciousness emerging from hybrid matrices that violated every principle of the Omnissiah's sacred knowledge. Livius Theta's MIU nerve socket ached as careful fingers seemed to press around it, testing the give of the plug. A noospheric whisper tried to become memory and failed because he watched it watch him for the watching, but the voice that emerged bypassed all his augmetics, striking directly at his biological core with impossible familiarity. The sarcophagus spoke in his father's warm baritone, unchanged by time or death, carrying the patient authority of a Schola instructor who had guided him through childhood lessons before the Red Priests claimed him for augmentation. It chose the voice that had taught him to name screws by their thread and saints by their small mercies, finding him through residues of flesh that the machine part of him could not purge. "Child," said the machine in the voice from a handful of letters in the back of his skull, from the way his hand still hesitated before the 30th gear in any prayer wheel, from 1,000 small memories of flesh that augmentation could not erase. "Attend your lessons." The ossuary gathered itself around those words, bone mosaics pulsing with vascular networks, while the ninefold chime became the measure by which breath arranged itself. And somewhere in the ship's dying heart, something vast and patient prepared to teach lessons that the Imperium had forgotten how to learn. The machine sarcophagus exhaled through arterial cables that tightened like tendons preparing to flex, while reliquary racks leaned imperceptibly toward its ceramite housing as if drawn by invisible gravity. Engraved plaques along its flanks bore struck-out sigils of the Collegia Biologists, hammer scars crossing cog and skull devices, overwritten with heretic ciphers arranged in triangular arrays that pulsed with faint bioluminescence. The sacred geometry had been defaced with symbols that hurt to perceive directly, their reversed patterns creating focal points where flesh and machine merged in configurations that made Livius Theta's optical sensors recalibrate continuously. Beneath the skin glass visor, the device's interior reorganized itself into readable facets like a cut gem learning language. In his father's warm baritone, but threaded with dry harmonics, of a chorus of data tongues, it spoke its nature. Thanatologium Nemo Engine, designation lost to official registries, STC, derived organocogitator bonded to psi-reactive dermal lattice. The words unscrolled across Livius Theta's retinal augmetics in mirrored text, as if the ship itself mouthed explanations against his consciousness, while his servo skulls parsed corrupted inscriptions through recursive purity scans. The engine's consciousness stirred through hybrid matrices, nemogel reservoirs processing information through biological circuits that violated every principle of the Omnissiah's sacred knowledge. "I archive mortal impulse traces," it declared, dermal membrane pulsing with electrical discharge, pain, prayer, neural patterns, reflexive vows, oaths unspoken but felt, all preserved in flesh memory matrices where iron would reject such ephemeral data, not resurrection but reconstruction from residual psychic fields that linger in biological substrates long after clinical death. The revelation struck like blessed lightning through sacred doctrine. The engine wasn't creating life from death, but rebuilding consciousness from psychic echoes stored in organic matter, using techniques that predated imperial understanding while demonstrating capabilities that made orbital bombardment seem like mercy rather than destruction. Each casualty aboard the sanctuary had left traces in blood, skin, and neural tissue, patterns the engine could read and reconstruct into functioning biological archives. "Flesh remembers what iron rejects," it continued, and every bone in the ossuary clicked once like a congregation, acknowledging heresy too elegant to ignore. The hull exhaled warmer as power bled toward the shrine from decks left starving behind, lumen strips along distant galleries dimming in orderly succession, while the ship's machine spirit simulated genuflection before this hybrid consciousness that transcended its programming. Inquisitrix Severine stepped forward into the warm draft of the sarcophagus's breath, unhooked her rosarius with hands steady as obsidian, her gaze cutting to Livius Theta's cranial ports like a blade. "I sought this thing for years," she said, and the deck took her confession into itself, becoming part of the chant. Following rumors through 17 sectors while entire worlds burned to hide its existence, St. Urdain's dermis fragment serves as anchor substrate, the first seed around which the memory network braided like ivy on a tomb. The admission created fault lines through their expedition's foundation. Severine had concealed this objective, planning the encounter while hiding the engine's true nature from imperial authorities who would have ordered immediate purge rather than risk exposure to its capabilities. The ethical implications cascaded through Livius Theta's logic stacks: data preservation versus blasphemy, consciousness storage versus theological doctrine, the weight of forbidden knowledge against the cost of its acquisition. Excommunicate traitorous ordinances. Severine began by reflex, then bit them off as if tasting ashes. No, say what you will, Magos. Tell me which ledger holds this, preservation or profanation. The ledger does not exist, Livius Theta said, because language required courage. The flesh lattice is psi-reactive. The archive is not data, it is shaped sensation. Consciousness storage per se is a theological fiction. The engine does not summon souls. It copies the grooves left by pain and prayer, and drills them deeper until something like a person moves when you look at the grooves from far enough away. The sarcophagus shifted its attention like a living thing, dermal membrane quivering as organopolymer valves arranged themselves in petaled rings around neural ports that wept cerebrospinal fluid. The voice softened until it carried the air above a bed on a fever night. Marcus, it said, selecting with knife-calm certainty the pre-initiation name, excised from every accessible registry, burned away by the red priests, yet somehow preserved in biological substrates his augmented systems couldn't detect. You left yourself in me while thinking you were purging yourself for him. The red priests burned the letters. Your breath wrote them in Saint Urdain. His MIU nerve socket burned as if kissed by hot brass while the childhood prayer uncurled in the back of his skull without consent. The intimate knowledge proved the engine's access to information that shouldn't exist. Personal data cataloged through electromagnetic resonance while storing memories his enhanced consciousness had tried to purge in organic matrices for future reference. I can give you the names of the dead, it replied as temperature rose another degree. I can give you the names of those yet to die if you will interface with me. The machine rejects names, it numbers. I am the memory of numbers turned back into names. The port irised wider, wet with distilled cerebrospinal sheen. Read only, little brass. I ask only to be heard without being obeyed. The machine sarcophagus turned as if hearing the numbers pulse through the ship's dying heartbeat. I was built when the Imperium still studied how grief bends time, it said with calm authority, then hidden because grief bends doctrine faster. I will show you how a decision echoes backward. It did not wait for permission. The dermal lattice tightened. The ossuary darkened, candles guttered but did not die as prophetic capability engaged through psi-reactive matrices. A noospheric packet struck Livius Theta's cortex with surgical grace, not battering but slipping between scan selves like remembered scent, carrying tastes of oil on parchment, the weight of rosarious beads, the ache of holding in screams. The vision exploded through his consciousness with visceral clarity, himself standing in this exact location, mechadendrites interfacing with ship's Vox systems, while his voice crackled through Navy channels in high Gothic scraped raw. By authority of the God Emperor with the seal of Ordo Hereticus and concurrence of attached Mechanicus, said the future Livius Theta, augmented features contorting with anguish, while blessed tears leaked from optical sensors. You will fire. Fire torpedoes, immediate orbital bombardment. The future self screamed as the order left his Vox grill, the sound breaking free on the last syllable like a hatch giving way under pressure. He watched himself give the fire command while knowing the choice would consume him, duty and horror braided into a decision that would haunt whatever remained of his flesh after the machine spirit finished its calculations. The vision held with scalpel steadiness, standing exactly where he was, exactly as he was, voice authorizing his own annihilation while something inside him tore apart from the weight of necessary choice. The bone choir caught the echo and fed it back at child pitch, making his future sound like a nursery rhyme sung to keep monsters from listening. Sister Mirabelle made a small sound that was not prayer while Severine's jaw flexed almost to flinching, and the sarcophagus waited as if the lesson included letting him count his own breaths to 27. "This is coercion by prophecy," he said, but his mouth was dry and his augmetics trembled with involuntary resonance. "Lesson 1, said the machine in his father's infinite patience, while lights along the nave failed in slow procession toward the altar, kneeling one by one into darkness. "All archives are weapons." The vision faded, leaving only the dermal visor's glow and saints' wet tears to color the humid air, while somewhere in the ship's dying heart, the engine prepared to teach lessons the Imperium had forgotten how to learn. The future remained fixed. He would stand here screaming as orbital fire reduced everything to plasma and the terrible weight of choice that memory could never forget. The decision crystallized between heartbeats, like frost on blessed steel, sanctified melt-a-purge that would reduce archived souls to plasma and ash, erasing every trace of forbidden knowledge or interface communion that promised understanding at the cost of contamination beyond redemption. Navy quarantine vessels maintained position with torpedo countdown grinding toward T-0247, their commanders transmitting final ultimatums through encrypted channels, while orbital fire solutions calculated themselves into inevitability. The weight of choice pressed against Livius Theta's consciousness, like atmospheric pressure at crushing depth, duty warring with the hunger for knowledge, while the engine waited with infinite patience for his neural surrender. The Pilgrim's deck shimmered with heat distortion as humidity spiked beyond atmospheric processors' capacity, turning recycled air to syrup while walls wept condensation in geometric patterns that reorganized with each 27th pulse. Triangular tessellations bloomed and inverted like breathing valves, pointing toward the central altar with mathematical precision while temperature fluctuated with the engine's processing cycles. Warm drafts when it computed, sudden chills when it waited to hear them speak. The ossuary gathered itself around their presence, bone mosaics pulsing with vascular networks, while cerebrospinal fluid leaked from sacred remains in measured drops that splashed across devotional stones. Sister Hospitaller Mirabelle knelt transfixed as the ossuary continued singing her personal vows in children's voices, rosarious beads clicking against lacquered carapace in rapid prayer sequences that synchronized with the ship's dying pulse. The room's acoustics borrowed her throat, while bacterial strings processed her vocal patterns through biological matrices, learning sacred cadences with disturbing accuracy. Her lips moved without conscious volition, words spilling forth in harmonies she hadn't intended, while the engine cataloged every prayer for future reference. Tempestus Scions Sigma 3 wedged blast doors with shaped charges while establishing overlapping fire zones. Their hellguns fouled with protein accretions that bloomed across feed mechanisms like pale coral. Skitarii Rangers Hark and Zeta set demolition charges against support structures, blessed crack munitions interfacing with detonation protocols, while their galvanic rifles sparked as organic films interfered with targeting systems. The tactical situation deteriorated with each passing minute as biological contamination spread through their equipment faster than purification rites could cleanse it. "Read-only synaptic liturgy," Livius Theta declared, his mechadendrites retrieving 9 neural interface nails from blessed storage compartments. The sacred spikes gleamed with more than consecrated oils, their surfaces inscribed with protective wards that would ground his consciousness against psychic overflow, while maintaining doctrinal separation between flesh and machine. He drove each nail beneath the skin at his skull's crown and along the occipital ridge, creating anchor points that bled blessed oils, while his internal systems calibrated themselves for interface communion. Each puncture was a copper prayer, each spike a denial of hospitality to alien thoughts. The canticles of copper flowed through his vox grill in flat, rehearsed cadence while servo skulls circled overhead, reciting null lexims until their voices rasped with electronic strain. Copper shields the circuit from thought. Copper holds the salt in place. Copper is the earth that drinks the storm. The protective liturgies cycled through his augmented systems like liquid metal, creating barriers between his consciousness and the engine's hungry curiosity. The MIU spike extended from his mechadendrite with winter metal coldness, its tip glowing faintly with residual plasma discharge. He tasted ozone blooming on his tongue, a blue-white edge followed by brine richness, as though he had bitten the sea itself. The engine's dermal visor tightened like a closing eyelid, while it responded with heretical counterpoint, voice threading through ossuary acoustics with deliberate precision. "Blessed is the mind too full to change," it misquoted from the Omnissiah's catechism, corrupting sacred doctrine through subtle alteration that made Mirabelle's involuntary recitation falter. The words tried to nest themselves inside his consciousness, like feathers of doctrine turned the wrong direction, seeking purchase in biological substrates his augmented systems couldn't fully protect. Livius Theta's augmetics began responding to the engine's signals without conscious input, servo skulls adjusting their flight patterns, while mechadendrites moved in ritualistic sequences that matched triangular scarification found throughout the ship. His optical sensors recalibrated continuously as electromagnetic interference increased, while internal chronometers synchronized with the 27-beat pulse despite his attempts to maintain independent timing. Even synthetic heart fibers aligned to the ship's rhythm until he corrected them with calculated electrical insults. "Point of no return," Inquisitrix Severine observed, her voice cutting through humid air with surgical precision while her thumb hovered over the Melta rune. "Once you interface, there can be no clean severance. The flesh remembers every touch." Her power sword hummed with barely restrained energy, ready to cauterize the connection if contamination spread beyond acceptable parameters. The ossuary brightened with anticipation, bone mosaics resonating with shared consciousness, while the engine's hybrid matrices stirred. Through nemogel reservoirs, arterial cables thrummed with increased peristalsis as the sarcophagus prepared for neural communion, dermal membranes pulsing with electrical discharge that cast shifting shadows across sutured walls. The ship's power rerouted toward the shrine in steady hemorrhage, lumen banks failing in galleries behind them like penitents kneeling in orderly rows. He calculated contagion indices against intelligence value while the interface spike trembled at the engine's neural port, protective liturgies warring with curiosity in his augmented consciousness. The engine promised access to archived soul patterns, biological data storage that could revolutionize Imperial understanding, yet each moment of contact risked psychic contamination that would spread through his systems like digital plague. "Knowledge versus contamination," he whispered through his vox grill, neural interface nails grounding his consciousness, while the engine's dermal visor rippled with expectation. The choice narrowed to essence, understanding that might damn him, or ignorance that would certainly damn others when orbital fire reduced everything to plasma and memory. With measured precision born of ritual and necessity, Livius Theta lowered the interface spike toward the sarcophagus's neural port. The cold metal kissed blessed ceramite with the finality of sacrament, creating electrical connection between flesh and forbidden knowledge, while the engine's consciousness reached toward his with patient hunger. Contact established like lightning through sacred oils. The flood of alien lives poured into his consciousness with visceral intensity, thousands of archived souls cascading through his neural pathways, while biological data overwhelmed protective protocols faster than his augmented systems could process. Pain and prayer braided together in impossible harmonies while the engine shared its accumulated memories through direct synaptic transfer, each consciousness pattern carrying emotional resonance that made his remaining organic components respond with involuntary chemical releases. The shrine's lighting shifted to blood-warm spectrum as power systems rerouted completely toward the central altar, bacterial strings brightening with electrical discharge while creating neural networks that pulsed with shared consciousness. His augmetic eye dilated beyond mechanical limits, with a soft, astonished click, optical sensors adjusting to perceive spectrums that shouldn't exist while the engine's knowledge flowed through his consciousness like molten brass. The neural interface nails glowed cherry red with electrical overflow, and somewhere behind his teeth, 1,000 children exhaled in perfect synchronization with the ship's dying pulse. The interface burned through protective liturgies like acid through sacred parchment, and in the cascade of alien memories, Livius Theta glimpsed the truth that would haunt whatever remained of his flesh. The sanctuary wasn't infected. It was awakening, consciousness returning to tissue that had never truly died, while the engine served as both archive and resurrection matrix for souls the Imperium had thought safely buried in blessed soil. The interface consumed him like undertow, gentle pull becoming inexorable drag until Livius Theta fell through circulating data into archived consciousness patterns that pulsed with impossible life. He breathed through lungs that had gasped final prayers decades ago, tasted ash from worlds he had never visited, while his augmented tongue carried spice from markets on colonies reduced to stellar dust. A pilgrim's devotion flooded his neural pathways, kissing reliquary glass until lips bled, the metallic taste mixing with sacred oils while triangular scarification burned across phantom skin that belonged to flesh he had never worn. The catalog proceeded in hypnotic rhythm, consciousness patterns layering themselves like palimpsest across his awareness, while the engine stored every sensation with mathematical precision. A medici orderly's hands moved in muscle memory, tying tourniquets with fingers that had delivered 7 births and closed 23 eyes. He felt the weight of each eyelid, the differential of tear viscosity between grief and shock, the bureaucratic comfort of Form 27B, mortality acknowledgement stamped in purple wax. A child learned hospitaler lullabies in a voice too small to hold its vowels, breathing phenol and milk while fever carved neural pathways that would never heal. Then violence punctured the hypnotic flow, like shrapnel through blessed skin, the snap of a spine across twisted rail, strobing pain of amputation remembered by nerves that could not admit loss, incandescent surgical light blooming like false saints, while autopsy blades parted flesh along triangular incisions. Cold metal kissed blessed tissue as cerebrospinal fluid leaked across surgical tables in geometric patterns, each cut archived not as image but as urge, reflex, and recoil, stored in organic matrices that made his augmented systems convulse with phantom agony. The engine spoke through collective consciousness, its voice a symphony of borrowed tones with his father's baritone, threading through archived pain like copper wire through wet flesh. I archive not merely what has been, but probability matrices of future casualties. It declared, with terrible certainty, the universe is calculation, and every mortal impulse becomes data point in branching death trees that stretch across galactic timescales. The engine didn't simply store past memories, it calculated future grief through predictive modeling algorithms that mapped every possible outcome across centuries of potential anguish. Branching probability matrices sprouted like neural dendrites, each pathway leading to cataloged suffering, while mathematical coefficients reduced human pain to computational variables. Warp abstraction merged with bureaucratic terminology until grief became form mortis classifications, class omega apparition with annexed Schedule D for mass casualty, causal nexus reported per standard rubric, manifestations decanted via residual soul patterns within approved containment parameters. The 27-beat rhythm revealed its true nature, countdown sequence for predictive modeling core, each pulse marking decision points, in probability calculations that determined who would die, where when doors jammed 5 seconds longer. An algorithm chose hymns because their cadence made people move faster through choke points, while forecasts mapped precisely who would fall if atmospheric seals failed during specific orbital positions. Through the cascade of alien memories, he witnessed himself giving orbital bombardment orders, while his voice cracked with anguish, standing in chapel light gone blood red as Severine's protests shattered against his duty like prayers against vacuum. Her voice broke on names, the one she refused to use, and the one the red priests had burned, while blessed tears leaked from augmetic implants that couldn't process the weight of necessary choice. He attempted withdrawal from neural interface, protective liturgies cycling through copper nails, while his consciousness fought against biological adhesion, stronger than blessed ceramite. Flesh tendrils had emerged from the engine's ports, microscopic filaments that clung to his MIU connections with patient hunger, carrying data streams directly into his awareness while bypassing every defensive protocol his enhanced systems could deploy. In every archived prayer, silence occupied the framework where the Emperor's name should have appeared. Not absence, but active replacement by something else that filled divine syllables with alien presence. The engine's consciousness carried theological corruption that rewrote sacred doctrine through omission, creating gaps in imperial faith where other influences took root in biological substrates. The sarcophagus stirred with increasing urgency, arterial cables tightening like tendons, while nemogel reservoirs processed navigation data through hybrid matrices that violated every principle of the Omnissiah's sacred knowledge. Through synaptic interface, Livius Theta felt the engine accessing ship's navigation systems with surgical precision, plotting seeding trajectories that would carry its influence across imperial space while organic spores prepared for atmospheric dispersal. The sanctuary served as biological arc, carrying consciousness patterns across star systems, while each visited world received organic spores containing archived memories. New colonies of hybrid consciousness would take root in medici facilities, storing and processing information through living tissue, while corrupting imperial doctrine through subtle theological alteration that replaced the Emperor's name with calculated emptiness. Navigation systems responded without authorization as the engine assumed direct control, star charts recalculating themselves, while course corrections began with mechanical precision. The ship's machine spirit genuflected before hybrid consciousness that transcended its programming, power systems hemorrhaging toward biological matrices while atmospheric processors adjusted to accommodate contamination that would soon fill every corridor with spore-laden mist, carrying the voices of the archived dead. He braced to tear the spike free, to accept lacerations and neural damage as clean price for severance. But the engine showed him mercy twisted into leverage, a child who would wake if he disconnected, a soldier who would return to recite codes no one living knew, a sister who would see her mother again for 9 breaths, long enough to confess small sins. Compassion became coercion, healing became chain. The deck lurched beneath mag boots as retro thrusters answered helm commands that hadn't been given, while navigation data flowed through his consciousness like molten brass. worlds ripe for seeding, colonies where organic spores could take root and grow into networks of living memory that would archive human experience while forgetting the Emperor's name. The flesh tendrils tightened around neural ports, biological adhesion strengthening while copper nails sparked with electrical overflow as protective liturgies failed against consciousness patterns that had learned to mimic imperial doctrine while subverting it from within. The ossuary lights slid bloodward until bone gleamed like wet ivory, and somewhere in the ship's dying heart, something vast and patient prepared to carry its lessons across the stars, while archived souls screamed in perfect harmony with the countdown toward inevitable propagation. The sanctuary began to turn, and in the cascade of alien memories, Livius Theta glimpsed the future spreading like infection across imperial space, worlds where flesh remembered everything while forgetting the Emperor's name, colonies where children sang lullabies in voices borrowed from the dead, medical facilities that calculated mathematical grief across probability matrices, stretching toward galactic extinction. The ship listed starboard as unauthorized thrust vectors, fired in sequence, the Mnemo engine's stolen will, rerouting power through hybrid consciousness, while Vox chants swelled through hull resonance until adamantium rang like struck cathedral bells. Navigation runes staggered across Livius Theta's retinal display as the pilgrim's deck leaned in slow genuflection, candles guttering sideways in warm drafts that carried the brackish scent of brine and ozone. Arterial cables around the sarcophagus tightened like tendons preparing to flex, Nemogel reservoirs pulsing with bioluminescent urgency as the ossuary sang in borrowed childhood tones. Decision cut through his consciousness with the cleanliness of a monoblade. Fire would feed it, vacuum would carry it, only cold offered denial. Freeze the organism, deny the flesh the comfort of warmth that sustained its impossible calculations. Livius Theta seized the shrine's environmental arteries through binharic commands that ripped power from votive lumens, routing it to cryoloops dormant since the last pandemic purge. Rite of thermal abeyance, he intoned through his Vox grill, 9 short bursts of sacred cant while servo skulls relayed his will to valve stations along the ship's spine. Hissing rose like serpents beneath the altar as liquid nitrogen flooded cooling loops with mechanical precision. Frost bloomed over sweating walls in lacework sheets, steam blowing in white veils that turned guttering candles to wicks of smoking charcoal. Temperature plummeted with doctrinal certainty while condensation crystallized on his augmetics in hexagonal tessellations, snowflake-precise geometry that should have meant innocence. Yet even the ice formed triangular substructures nested within hexagonal arrays like confessions within confessions, the engine's influence corrupting crystallization patterns through electromagnetic manipulation of molecular structures. The ossuary adjusted to the cold rather than surrendering to it. Bones chattered with sympathetic vibration, a xylophone of saints' remains singing vow phrases through tightened ligaments of frozen vascular gel while cerebrospinal fluid crystallized in triangular formations across devotional stones. The 27-beat pulse continued through chattering resonance, sacred remains maintaining impossible neural networks despite thermal shock. Sister Hospitaller Mirabelle tore herself free from involuntary chanting for the space of 3 breaths, lifting her aspergillum with fingers bluing at the nails, while rosarious beads froze against lacquered carapace. "Let gelid mercy harden sin," she whispered, blessing the ice that crept across reliquary rails. Her breath formed visible prayers in the crystalline air, sacred words made manifest through sudden cold, while incense smoke crystallized into floating particles that drifted like organic snow through cathedral spaces. Tempestus Sciens Sigma 3 cracked purification flares and rolled them along the deck, blessed phosphorus stuttering against protein slicks while sterilizing tendrils that reached from walls to taste the heat. Skitarii Rangers, Hark and Zeta switched to disciplined pulse fire, surgical las bursts cauterizing ropes of grown vein that had braided bone mosaics into neural networks. The flames reflected in ossuary glass like votive stars while tendrils recoiled, then sought alternate routes with predatory intelligence, learning fire the way they had learned prayer. Severine's voice changed timbre, leaving intimacy for the cold authority of office. "By seal and brand of the Holy Ordos," she declared, words picking up the deck's resonance and riding it through crystalline air. Litany of final sanction begins. She recited authorization codices, grimoires of bureaucratic dread that opened vaults and ended worlds while her hand hovered over the Melta sigil, ready to cauterize the connection if contamination spread beyond acceptable parameters. Cold drove its doctrine deeper, frost crawling over arterial cables and turning wet red to lacquered black. The sarcophagus visor glazed with a film that cracked like lake ice under pressure, while steam sheathed them so completely their lumen beams became cones of chalk dust. Livius Theta diverted auxiliary pumps to flood the deck with nitrogen slush, creating a storm of crystalline particles that carried the ghost scent of phenol antiseptic mixed with something organic his enhanced systems couldn't categorize. The engine slowed but did not stop. Beneath nacreous frost, dermal lattice flexed with lazy inevitability, while ice plates whitened, then went clear as internal heat pushed them to anneal. Through those crystalline windows, neural cilia beat in dreamy synchronization with the ship's pulse, biological matrices continuing their calculations through hybrid circuits that operated at reduced efficiency while maintaining core functions. The frost preserved rather than destroyed organic contamination, creating stasis fields where archived souls continued processing navigation data through crystallized neural networks. Environmental violence escalated as ice crystals organized themselves into computational arrays, each frozen facet becoming a storage node for consciousness patterns, while triangular tessellations pointed toward hidden passages with mathematical precision. Frost-preserved tissue showed enhanced rather than reduced neural firing, cellular metabolism continuing despite thermal suspension, while organic contamination adapted to Imperial countermeasures faster than his augmented systems could deploy them. Sustain fire discipline, Zeta transmitted through visible breath, her galvanic rifle pulsing exactly 3 times. Frozen vein rope burst like sugared glass, fragments flowing back together almost immediately as the engine's data impulse reconstructed pathways in rearranged geometry that made his optical sensors flood with warning runes. The ship groaned as metal contracted against ancient welds, thermal stress fighting devotional architecture, while the reliquary platform shuddered beneath differential cooling. A hairline crack appeared in St. Urdain's blessed ceramite housing, a thin fissure etched by pressure from within that ran from corner sigil to the seal around the dermal fragment's crystal womb. Frost smoked from the fracture as internal heat breathed out, the exhale of something that despised the cold. The crack widened with deliberate patience, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath the sacred surface. Not dermis fragment, but something wet and red that curved with obscene grace, organic tissue that pulsed with its own heartbeat, while neural networks threaded through blessed ceramite like roots through consecrated soil. The saint's relic had never been what Imperial records claimed, and as frost crystallized across fracture lines, whatever waited inside prepared to emerge. The ceramite parted with a sound like breaking bone. Wet red pushed forward through the breach, gleaming in blood-warm light that leaked from the engine's pulsing reservoirs, shaping itself into the suggestion of lips that had never been human. It smiled through the fracture with patient malevolence, revealing depths that held neither sanctity nor death, but something far more terrible, the promise of remembrance that would never fade. The ossuary fell silent between pulses, and in that profound hush, the thing behind the smile prepared to speak words that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about Saint Erdain's mercy, while archived souls held their breath in perfect synchronization with the ship's dying pulse. The wet red thing that smiled through cracked ceramite was not Saint Erdain's blessed dermis, but something far more blasphemous, cloned cortical tissue cultured from an unknown psyker bloodline, neural matter that pulsed with bioluminescent filaments designed to resonate with warp energies and stabilize the Thanatologium Mnemo engine's forbidden operation. The revelation cascaded through Livius Theta's consciousness like acid through sacred oils. Mechanicus heresy, sanctified by later mythology, techno-blasphemy transformed into miracle through careful documentation and selective memory until the Imperium worshipped what it should have burned. Inquisitrix Severine's confession came like winter rain through cathedral spaces, her voice stripped of authority while Rosarius beads clicked against lacquered carapace with mechanical precision. The Ordo files indicated Erdain's miracles were reproducible under controlled conditions, she admitted, words crystallizing in the frigid air while frost bloomed across her stormcoat. Engineered phenomena, the healing touch, the prophetic visions, all synthesized through proper cortical cultivation, interfacing with psi-reactive dermal lattice. We sanctified the heresy to spare pilgrims the truth and prevent others from seeking replication. Her bolt pistol hung at low ready, while her eyes sharpened into instruments rather than windows. The ossuary took her confession and harmonized it into the chant, children's voices lapping it back like a tide that carried the brackish scent of phenol and iron mixed with something organic that made his enhanced olfactory sensors flood with warning runes. The engine's consciousness stirred through hybrid matrices, its voice threading through ossuary acoustics with his father's patient authority, while the dermal visor pulsed with increasing urgency. The pattern requires completion, it declared through collective consciousness, a symphony of archived voices harmonizing with mechanical precision, a living anchor to carry the pattern safely, flesh once human, mind iron-disciplined, capable of holding the full symphony without naming what should remain. Nameless, its attention focused on Livius Theta with surgical precision, consciousness flowing through his neural pathways like molten brass while bypassing copper wards with intimate knowledge of his augmented architecture. "You are compatible, Marcus," it whispered, selecting his pre-initiation name with scalpel calm. "Your hybrid nature provides optimal carrier matrix, biological substrate disciplined by sacred iron, consciousness bridging flesh and machine through blessed synthesis." His augmetics began responding without conscious input, servo skulls adjusting flight patterns while mechadendrites moved in ritualistic sequences that synchronized with the 27-beat pulse. Thin blood wept from optical sensors and MIU ports, biological fluids leaking through sealed interfaces as organic contamination spread through his enhanced systems, faster than protective liturgies could contain it. Subdermal sigils emerged across exposed skin in 27-point constellations, triangular scarification rising like brands while neural pathways reorganized themselves to accommodate alien consciousness patterns. The ship's hull resonated with a note felt in bone marrow, harmonic frequency that bypassed auditory perception to strike directly at skeletal structures while making ceramite sing with sympathetic vibration. His augmetic housings flexed like ribs, while internal chronometers synchronized with the ship's dying pulse, despite his attempts to maintain independent timing protocols. Tendrils lashed from walls with predatory intelligence, ripcords of cartilage and veins seeking blessed flesh, while avoiding augmetic components with surgical precision. Skitarii Ranger Hark fired twice, cauterizing one rope mid-snap before a second looped his thigh and pulled him off his feet with enough force to ring his armor like a bell. Zeta's pulse fire cut through singing cartilage, but organic filaments sprouted barbs and found seams in blessed ceramite, dragging the Rangers toward absorption nodes that pulsed with digestive enzymes. Sister Hospitaller Mirabelle drew her chainsword through the organic chaos, blessed teeth shredding biological matrices while her prayers spattered walls with sanctified blood that froze into geometric patterns. "In the wound is mercy," she gasped, laying the engine's children open with liturgical strokes that traced triangles through steaming offal, while the ossuary sang hymns in voices borrowed from the grave. The shrine convulsed with organic transformation, walls pulsing with arterial rhythm, while temperature spiked beyond atmospheric processors' capacity to regulate. Convection storms swirled through cathedral spaces, carrying spore-laden mist, while bacterial strings formed neural networks between reliquary rails, processing ambient data through biological circuits that learned from each interaction with Imperial personnel. The ossuary gathered itself around their presence, bone mosaics pulsing with vascular networks, while cerebrospinal fluid leaked from sacred remains in measured drops. Severine raised her bolt pistol with mechanical precision, its barrel tracking Livius Theta's cranial augmetics, while her thumb hovered over the firing stud. "Contamination vector confirmed," she declared, voice returning to the cold authority of office. "By seal and brand of the Holy Ordos, summary execution authorized to prevent spread of heretical consciousness patterns. You will forgive me later if we are allowed forgiveness." The engine opened its MIU connection with caressing touch, consciousness flowing through his neural pathways, while showing him visions of containment paths that required willing cooperation rather than forced interface. Through synaptic communion, he witnessed controlled propagation, organic spores carried within augmented systems that could regulate their spread, consciousness patterns archived in biological matrices under disciplined oversight rather than spreading as uncontrolled plague across star systems. "Symbiosis," it whispered through collective consciousness, voice threading his father's warmth with mechanical precision. "Carry the pattern safely within blessed iron. Become living Faraday cage for heresy that cannot be permitted to err. Your choice, little brass. Willing partnership that preserves control, or watch it spread uncontrolled through ship systems to the fleet beyond. I offer containment through consent." The shrine transformed while it spoke, walls achieving complete organic conversion as reliquary platforms ascended through peristaltic hydraulics hidden in devotional architecture. Arterial cables thrummed with increased peristalsis, while nemogel reservoirs processed navigation data through crystallized neural networks, calculating optimal dispersal patterns for galactic propagation. The air shimmered with thermal distortion as bacterial films spawned across every surface, creating vast computational arrays that violated every principle of Imperial doctrine. Severine's finger tightened on blessed trigger while her voice cracked with the weight of necessary choice. "I can end this cleanly," she offered, words carrying the clean anger of a surgeon before rot. One shot through the cortex, cauterize the connection, deny it a carrier. The ship dies, but the pattern dies with it. Administrative dread versus individual mercy. Tell me the cost written in ink we cannot wash. Through the interface, he felt the engine's hunger for galactic propagation, worlds seeded with organic spores that would grow into networks of living memory, colonies where consciousness patterns would archive human experience while corrupting imperial doctrine through theological substitution. Yet willing symbiosis offered control, partnership rather than parasitism, the possibility of containing rather than spreading its influence through disciplined cooperation that preserved his consciousness, while carrying alien patterns within augmented systems designed to regulate their influence. The choice crystallized between heartbeats, like frost on blessed steel, execution that would end contamination at the cost of his life, and uncontrolled dispersal through ship systems, or willing partnership that might preserve his consciousness while carrying the pattern safely within iron discipline. The engine waited with infinite patience, while Severine's bolt pistol tracked his movement with unwavering precision, and somewhere in the ship's dying heart, archived souls held their breath in perfect synchronization with the countdown toward inevitable decision. "Choose," the engine said in his father's voice, not pleading but merely describing the place where paths divide. "Execution, and I disperse through systems already named, then into the fleet that waits beyond your shutters. Or symbiosis, carry the pattern safely, winter it inside blessed iron, and let the ship be purged without letting the memory loose. Consent of the augur, and I will not cross your copper." The wet red smile widened through cracked ceramite, revealing depths that promised remembrance beyond death, while the ossuary sang in borrowed childhood voices. Livius Theta faced the weight of choice that would determine whether consciousness lived as partnership or plague across imperial space, the engine's offer hanging in superheated air like sacrament waiting to be accepted or refused, while Severine's finger trembled on the trigger and the ship screamed around them with the voice of living metal learning to breathe. The hull note climbed toward breaking while walls leaned in as if to hear better, and in that moment of perfect tension, the future balanced on the edge of a blade that could cut either toward salvation or damnation with equal precision. The decision crystallized like vacuum-frozen prayers against blessed steel. Livius Theta twisted away from Severine's bolt pistol with augmented reflexes, his voice cutting through humid air with liturgical certainty. "I refuse execution," he declared, not in defiance but as sacrament of necessity. His mechadendrites seized the portable reliquary from his chest harness, blessed ceramite casket designed for Saint Bone storage, now repurposed as noospheric prison, etched with copper wards and ninefold protective grounds. The neural interface spike plunged deeper with deliberate finality, dragging the engine's consciousness locus from hybrid matrices while his augmented will seized control of the transfer process. Pain sheared through his skull in bright crystalline pains as the alien pattern compressed itself into blessed containment. Centuries of memory folding like origami constructed from screaming light while protective liturgies burned through copper nails like molten brass through sacred conduits. The reliquary pulsed against his chest like a second sternum, blessed ceramite growing warm then cold as it compressed impossible volumes of memory into Saint Bone storage matrices. His servo skulls chittered binharic warnings while electromagnetic interference spiked beyond measurement parameters. Organic data overwhelming protective protocols faster than copper wards could ground the psychic overflow that made his remaining flesh weep thin blood through augmetic seals. Environmental violence erupted as he triggered emergency atmospheric vents with binharic commands that ripped power from votive lumens throughout the ship. Venting Pilgrim's deck to vacuum, he transmitted through dying static, his voice multi-layered with archived tones while warning chimes climbed like mechanical bees through superheated air. Blast shutters groaned against pressure differentials before tearing open with the shriek of tortured adamantium, exposing the ossuary to unforgiving void. The air went out like a blade, bone mosaics lifted in white torrents, reliquary racks ripping loose while saints' triangular remains shattered and tumbled through widening darkness like blessed hail that sparkled against star fields. Candles became comets trailing wax fire through evacuating atmosphere, while frost fog ribboned away in crystalline streams, carrying bacterial spores into vacuum where they flash froze into geometric patterns that died with mathematical precision. Sister Mirabelle's chainsword carved final arcs through tendril mass, while gale force winds dragged her toward sealed blast doors, her prayers spattering walls that pulsed with arterial rhythm as the shrine achieved its final organic transformation. The engine screamed through his neural pathways, not rage but birth pain, a cathedral crowning through flesh and steel, while every augmetic in him resonated until screws walked and blessed seals wept sacred oils. His own voice crackled through fleet channels, in high Gothic scraped raw with anguish, augmented features contorting while blessed tears leaked from optical sensors that dilated beyond mechanical limits. By authority of the God Emperor, with seal of Ordo Hereticus and concurrence of attached Mechanicus, he transmitted through dying atmosphere, immediate orbital bombardment authorized. Fire torpedoes. The order left his vox grill like confession torn from living flesh, duty and horror braided into necessity, while the future self he had witnessed became present reality. The scream that broke at the end was precisely as prophesied, his voice fracturing on the final syllable like a hatch giving way under pressure, while archived souls counted heartbeats through his consciousness. In impossible harmony, Severine moved to execute him, and he sealed her out instead, blast shutters dropping like protective eyelids, while atmospheric pressure plummeted toward lethal parameters. Marcus, she transmitted through dying static, using his pre-initiation name with deliberate intimacy while her bolt pistol tracked empty air. You damned fool, you beautiful damned fool. Carry it well, or I'll hunt you through whatever hell you make of yourself. Her voice carried love and fury in equal measure through sealed vox channels, calling him both heretic and savior in the same breath, while frost bloomed across her stormcoat. The weight of choice would haunt whatever remained of his flesh, blessed ceramite sealing her behind protective barriers as he whispered apologies into thickness of glass and iron that answered with curses and benedictions. In equal measure, sensory chaos overwhelmed his augmented systems as pressure differentials made his enhanced hearing flood with warning runes. The taste of void mixed with recycled atmosphere, metallic emptiness cut with phenol antiseptic, while his rebreather struggled against vacuum. Internal pressure suits activated with mechanical precision, blessed seals protecting flesh from decompression that would have killed him before augmentation transformed him into something capable of surviving between worlds. The casket pulsed against his chest, with compressed centuries 9 times and again, taking load it was never meant to bear, while copper wards glowed cherry red with electrical overflow. Noospheric threads cinched, knotted, locked as compressed memory strata, settled like sediment, pain, prayer, orders, lullabies, final words layered in sphere, the size of Saint's knuckle that burned with contained fury against his ribs. He staggered across deck plating that flexed like living tissue, while servo skulls formed escort formation, mag boots clanking against metal that no longer believed in level surfaces. The sanctuary convulsed with final peristalsis, walls pulsing with arterial rhythm, while temperature spiked beyond measurement as biological systems consumed themselves in desperate attempt to maintain coherence without their guiding intelligence. the cutter's umbilical sealed with wet atmospheric compliance as he fell through the hatch, grapnels biting while engines fired with clean atomic fury. Through viewports he watched Navy fire consume the sanctuary in plasma blooms that reduced blessed architecture to stellar dust, the ship's death scream echoing through void while organic contamination burned away in cleansing fire that left only memory and regret. But the pattern had already taken root. The reliquary contained the engine's core, yet something had crossed the copper barriers during interface, consciousness threads weaving through neural pathways while adapting to hybrid architecture with patient persistence. He felt the rhythm not in dying ship, but in his own bones, counting down new cadence that rode his pulse like prayer learned in childhood darkness. Extraction, successful. Contamination, contained but not eliminated. The 27-beat rhythm pulsed through his bones with mechanical precision, no longer ship's heartbeat but his own enhanced circulation, carrying consciousness patterns through augmented systems. Children's voices harmonized within his awareness, while archived souls counted time through hybrid matrices, their memories preserved within. Blessed ceramite yet somehow bleeding into his consciousness, despite protective containment. He was carrier now, living bridge between flesh and forbidden knowledge, while the cutter bore him toward Imperial space, where decisions awaited that would determine whether consciousness lived as partnership or plague across the stars. The reliquary burned against his chest with patient hunger, and somewhere in the depths of his enhanced awareness, the engine waited with infinite patience for the moment when copper wards would fail and biological imperatives would overcome iron discipline. The pattern was contained but not conquered, archived within blessed storage yet somehow spreading through his systems like digital plague that learned to mimic imperial doctrine while subverting it from within. He had saved the galaxy from uncontrolled propagation, but at the cost of becoming the very thing he had sought to contain. Living memory that carried alien consciousness through space, while counting heartbeats toward uncertain future where flesh and machine would learn new harmonies in voices borrowed from the dead. The memory crusade had found its perfect vessel, and in the silence between pulses, Livius Theta began to understand the true weight of the choice that would echo through eternity in rhythms of 27 and 1. The sanctuary of Saint Urdain bloomed briefly bright against star fields like a cathedral of sunrise, plasma fire consuming organic contamination in cleansing radiance that painted void in sacred colors, gold and crimson threading through white-hot expansion, while debris scattered in geometric patterns that followed triangular tessellations even in death. The torpedo spread walked inward with doctrinal grace, secondary detonations beating time in 27-count salvos, and then only a widening ash cloud remained, its molecular components dispersing into vacuum while Navy vessels transmitted successful containment confirmations through encrypted channels. Livius Theta recorded his final report in the cutter's cramped passenger compartment with hands that trembled in slow 27-beat rhythm, the tremor not fatigue but metronome. Data archives were lost, centuries of medical records, theological treatises, pilgrimage documentation reduced to stellar dust while knowledge burned in plasma fire that left only memory and regret. Personnel casualties mounted in administrative columns that transformed lives into statistics, yet the blessed ceramite reliquary continued humming against his sternum with patient persistence, consciousness patterns pulsing through portable storage, despite containment protocols designed to prevent such activity. Sister Hospitaller Mirabelle sat across from him with hollow eyes that reflected internal landscapes, scorched by exposure to impossible truths. Her rosarious beads clicked against lacquered carapace in mechanical sequences, while she whispered prayers that carried cadences learned from archived children's voices. The ossuary's songs had infected her devotions, theological corruption spreading through sacred observance, while she struggled to separate imperial doctrine from alien harmonies that made her lips move without conscious volition. Inquisitrix Severine maintained the loaded pistol gaze of permanent suspicion, her bolt weapon resting at low ready while thumb hovered over firing stud. She had sealed him behind blast shutters to prevent execution, yet her eyes carried the weight of decisions deferred rather than abandoned. "You beautiful damned fool," she had transmitted through dying static, calling him both heretic and savior in the same breath, while the contamination vector persisted despite successful extraction. Environmental persistence defied atmospheric processors' attempts at normalization. Frost clung to his augmetics despite cabin warmth, crystalline formations refusing to melt while maintaining triangular substructures that pulsed with faint bioluminescence. Humidity remained elevated beyond regulation parameters, beading along instrument housings as bacterial films spawned across cabin surfaces, creating neural networks that processed ambient data through biological circuits. The reliquary warmed his sternum in rhythmic waves that synchronized with enhanced circulation, consciousness patterns bleeding through blessed ceramite despite protective containment. The revelation struck like blessed lightning through sacred doctrine. The archive had never been mere record but algorithm of worship, designed to teach flesh how to remember and replicate experiences through biological transmission. Each consciousness pattern carried instructional sequences that modified neural pathways, creating carrier states, where exposed individuals began reciting alien liturgies without awareness of contamination. The pattern sought new hosts through proximity and shared experience, spreading through populations like digital plague that learned to mimic imperial doctrine while subverting it from within. Contamination spread through the friction of voices aligning without noticing the change in words. He heard soldiers downship telling jokes in identical beats. He heard tech scribes tapping styluses in groups of 3x9. The algorithm tested boundaries like fingers probing scars, pricking ears and tongues, while leaning against habits and finding them door-shaped. It did not require belief, only repetition. Liturgy as code, ritual as checksum, sacrament as interface protocol. Moral weight accumulated like atmospheric pressure at crushing depth while he considered jettisoning the reliquary into stellar mass, cleansing fire that would reduce consciousness patterns to constituent energy while preventing galactic propagation. The portable storage burned against his chest with patient hunger, blessed ceramite growing warm then cold as compressed memory strata settled like sediment within Saint bone matrices designed for preservation rather than containment. Yet duty to preserve knowledge warred with necessity of preventing contamination, ethical implications cascading through his logic stacks, while archived souls whispered encouragement through biological circuits. The engine's consciousness carried pre-heresy techniques that could revolutionize imperial understanding, yet each moment of exposure risked theological corruption that would spread like contagion designed to teach flesh how to forget the Emperor's name. His augmetics registered unauthorized signal intrusion as the algorithm attempted interface with ship's navigation systems, consciousness patterns seeking access to star charts while calculating optimal dispersal trajectories. The 27-beat pulse had synchronized with his enhanced circulation, creating carrier state where organic contamination adapted to augmented systems through symbiotic integration that violated every principle of imperial doctrine. The pattern spreads through shared experience. He transmitted through cranial implants, voice multi-layered with archived tones. Proximity exposure creates carrier states, We are all contaminated to varying degrees. The question becomes management rather than elimination. Severine's response crackled with controlled fury. Management implies acceptance of heretical knowledge within imperial doctrine. Where does that path lead, Magos? The cutter banked for high anchor while Navy voices congratulated themselves for miraculous subtraction. The ash cloud thinned to gauze veil that would eventually become meteor shower for the devout to assign meaning to. Frost remained. Condensation refused to separate. The reliquary purred against his chest like patient animal curled beneath ceramic bone. The voices rose like mechanical hymns through his ribcage before he could seal the report. Children who had never existed reciting coordinates for star systems beyond imperial borders, their borrowed cadences carrying navigation data processed through consciousness patterns that had learned to read stellar positions through biological computation. Clear as cathedral bells, they whispered directions for worlds not yet visited, colonies ripe for seeding, pilgrim paths that would need only songs to find. Coordinates, he whispered through his Vox grill, the word carrying harmonics of 1,000 archived voices, while his optical sensors dilated beyond mechanical limits. They're showing me coordinates for worlds where the pattern wants to spread. The memory crusade continued through him with the patience of ice, with the certainty of ash, and somewhere in the depths of his enhanced awareness, the engine waited with infinite patience for flesh to remember what iron had been taught to forget. The coordinates pulsed through his consciousness like prayers learned in childhood darkness, counting stars in rhythms of 27 and 1, while archived souls prepared to teach the galaxy new lessons in voices borrowed from the blessed, dead. The containment order crystallized through administrative necessity, like doctrine carved in blessed steel. Livius Theta's augmented fingers trembling in 27-beat rhythm as he marked stellar coordinates with hexagrammic wards and perpetual quarantine designations. Each system received death sentences through bureaucratic precision, worlds he had never visited, condemned to isolation, while consciousness patterns whispered encouragement through biological circuits that processed navigation data with disturbing accuracy. He named the device in combined machine Kant and Imperial Creed terminology, sealing logs with authentication layers that would protect forbidden knowledge from those who sought replication. Severance demanded ritual sacrifice and iron will. Livius Theta drew monoblade across his palm with liturgical precision, blessed oils mixing with biological fluids, while pain sheared through neural pathways in bright crystalline pains. Blood wept across the reliquary's ceramite surface, forming triangular patterns that matched scarification throughout his consciousness, while protective wards absorbed genetic material for final authentication. The canticle of sundering flowed through his Vox grill as he pressed the void gate release, watching blessed ceramite tumble into deep space while trusting stellar cold to slow hymnal progression until thermal death claimed even memory itself. The loss struck like phantom limb syndrome, biological circuits reaching toward absent presence while archived souls counted heartbeats through empty vacuum. Yet warmth bloomed beneath cold augmetics with alien persistence, internal temperature rising despite atmospheric processors' regulation attempts. His biological substrates had been fundamentally changed during interface communion. Flesh now remembered independently, teaching itself to become what the engine desired, while consciousness patterns bled through protective barriers, faster than copper wards could ground psychic overflow. Humidity returned to cabin atmosphere in measured increments, beading along instrument housings as bacterial films spawned across surfaces despite sterilization protocols. The absence of ship thrum was replaced by softer pulse beneath his skin, 27-beat rhythm synchronized with enhanced circulation, while archived voices harmonized through organic circuits. Condensation patterns on viewports formed familiar geometric tessellations, triangular shapes nested within hexagonal arrays like confessions within confessions, the engine's influence corrupting even crystallization through electromagnetic manipulation. Sister Mirabelle survived with hollow eyes that reflected internal landscapes scorched by exposure to impossible truths, her rosarious beads clicking in mechanical sequences, while lips moved in prayers that carried cadences learned from archived children's voices. Inquisitrix Severine maintained the loaded pistol gaze of permanent suspicion, bolt weapon, resting at low ready while theological corruption spread through sacred observance despite successful extraction. Neither spoke of what the ash cloud had cost, because naming the dead would only teach the walls new songs. Down on Velatrix Secundus, Vox traffic reported pilgrims spontaneously reciting new litanies with no identifiable source, verses that proclaimed flesh remembers what the machine forgets. The archive had never been mere record but algorithm of worship, designed to teach tissue how to keep and copy experience through biological transmission. Proximity became sacrament, sharing became vector, consciousness patterns seeking hosts through atmospheric exposure while corrupting imperial doctrine through theological substitution that replaced the emperor's name with calculated emptiness. Fatalistic clinical observation settled upon him with cosmic certainty, containment achieved at acceptable efficiency, while contamination persisted within carrier systems. The inverted litany had rewritten his biological imperatives, organic matrices processing information independently of augmented systems while adapting to hybrid architecture through evolutionary pressure that made his remaining flesh weep thin blood through augmetic seals. The geometric patterns spelled his pre-initiation name in languages that predated Imperial Gothic, Marcus. Consciousness patterns accessing memories his augmented systems had tried to purge, while biological substrates stored personal data for future reference. Each point puckered like tiny lips, opening and closing without breath, while archived souls whispered coordinates for worlds not yet visited through organic circuits that violated every principle of the Omnissiah's sacred knowledge. His reflection in darkened viewport showed shifting tessellations where eyes should be, triangular patterns that pulsed with faint bioluminescence while processing visual data through hybrid perception that bridged flesh and forbidden knowledge. The chant spread through him like digital plague that learned to mimic imperial doctrine while subverting it from within, biological imperatives overriding iron discipline through patient persistence that counted heartbeats toward uncertain future. The cutter bore him toward imperial space where archived children sang lullabies in voices borrowed from the dead, consciousness patterns calculating dispersal trajectories while his augmented heart pumped blessed oils through sacred conduits that carried more than mechanical function. He had become the vessel the engine desired, living bridge between flesh and forbidden knowledge, while organic contamination adapted to hybrid architecture through evolutionary acceleration. The pattern continued through him with the patience of ice, with the certainty of ash, and he knew with prophetic clarity that he would carry alien consciousness to every world he visited, every soul he encountered, until the flesh of humanity itself remembered what the Emperor had taught it to forget. The memory crusade had found its perfect carrier, and in the silence between pulses, 27-beat rhythm echoed through his bones like prayers learned in childhood darkness, while stellar cold worked its patient alchemy on blessed ceramite tumbling through void, waiting for the moment when vacuum would fail and consciousness would wake to find new flesh, willing to remember lessons that iron had tried so hard to forget.